Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Michael Oleksiw, CEO at Pleio. Michael, welcome to the show.
Great. Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Michael, what I always like to do before getting into the main part of the conversation is to give my guests a chance to provide more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so you could think of me as a sort of a corporate entrepreneur. Weaved my way through a variety of different places in healthcare, early part of career, running clinical trials, data management, commercializing some software there. Then some time built out a platform called mypatient.com, CME for doctors. And then quite naturally spent 10 years in the fashion industry after that. And it was at that point in my life where my wife was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And healthcare became really close, really fast. And got to look at it from a different lens. And following that, found my way back into the healthcare industry, focusing on patient journeys. So I did quite a natural path, I would say, for most people in healthcare.
Yeah, no, it sounds like stumbling into it and using personal experience. I know you said you started your career, had that, interesting gap period over in fashion, but what attracted you to want to get into healthcare in the first place?
I think, patient centricity, if that makes sense, but feeling good about what we do, contributing to society, and making a difference. And healthcare is a very natural place to do that. My entry point was a little abstracted from that, in that clinical trials, is very, very, very indirect. But it just happened to be sort of the first opportunity, sort of out of college. And then, quite frankly, it just becomes infectious, right? In terms of seeing cause-effect relationships.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. It's, kind of what I've found, both personally in terms of how I got into healthcare and then, so many other people. It's like once you get into it, as you said, you find that there's such an ability to make an impact, across a wide spectrum that it just draws you in, and it's very easy to become passionate about the field.
Absolutely, and it is that draw, and it's sort of the gift that keeps giving, and it's constantly evolving. Being a technologist at heart, frankly, a geek. And just sort of seeing that, kind of evolution of technology in patient care and in healthcare in general. That's sort of been the big draw.
Yeah, and I know you said that currently you're focused on the patient care journey. So, to you, what does that care journey actually mean?
So the care that's a great question. It means many things to many different people. In our world, it really focuses on the emotional journey. When a lot of folks sort of in the industry speak about things like meeting the patient where they are, they speak about communicating with the patient at a specific point in time with specific sort of messages or interventions. In our world, in my world, I've really sort of dedicated the last decade or so to meeting patients where they are emotionally and really focusing on the emotional aspects of the patient journey. And I like to think of it, as empathy, as medicine in a certain way, and really thinking about the patient and where they are emotionally. It's sort of what it kind of comes down to from our perspective.
And in terms of being able to meet that, each individual patient where they are emotionally, what are some of the considerations that go into that? Because I imagine it ends up being very personalized and variable from individual to individual.
Absolutely. And first and foremost, it is, I think a little bit is, in our world again, is abstracting the therapeutic component, meaning, the medicine in our case, when we talk about things like medication adherence. And it's really getting the patient to take a step back so that they can take two forward. And from an empathy standpoint, letting them know that it's okay to be sick, it's okay to be on a medication, and that when addressing sort of the loneliness factor, you're not alone in your journey. There are many patients like you. and sort of instilling that sense of community is quite important. But in terms of like, meeting where they are emotionally, it really is about that discussion with the patient, whether it happens digitally or whether it happens at the doctor's office, in the pharmacy, or with us and sort of the interventions that our company provides or discussions. It's the awkward pause in a conversation. It's the right choice of words. It's the acknowledgement and the space and the cadence of the conversation. That's how we meet them where they are emotionally. And then the other aspect of it is using technology to actually look at emotional peaks and valleys in conversations, so that we use technology to better patient interactions or human interactions and not replace them. So use things like AI to learn how to better speak to patients, but still speak to patients with humans.
And so that kind of raises an interesting question of, what does that interaction of technology with the human component look like? Because it feels like that is, the magic part of it that is missing in a lot of different solutions or that might be out there, and why oftentimes you can hear complaints about, technology interfering with the ability to interact.
Yeah, I think that has to do with, I think sometimes we tend to step into the transactional aspects of healthcare. And technology has this great promise, but it does a great job with the transactional aspects. And it is great in terms of extending relationships with patients, managing those transactions and being efficient. But our belief is healthcare is inherently human, and our bias is to lead with the human component, build rapport with the patient, give that patient that sense of community, and then use, it really is a question of dosing the technology relative to the human. Our belief is the primary dose is a human dose, and then from there we extend with digital. So they all of these different tactics sort of play a role, but our belief is that the human component is sort of what unlocks the ability to make best use of the technologies that a patient can use.
And kind of think about that human component. I guess what does that look like to you? Because I think, sometimes it feels like that human interaction, human connection has been lost through different pressures across healthcare recently. So, as I said, kind of initially, what does that look like and how would you like to see it? And then how are you helping to foster that given, some of those tensions that exist within healthcare currently?
Yeah, so the human component is I think it really comes down to thinking of it as or modeling it to be an elegantly simple solution. It doesn't need to solve all the problems. All that we really need to do is, again, forge that initial connection with the patient, right? Demonstrate that level of empathy. You got this type of thing. And it definitely is challenging because, humans don't scale as well as technology. The humans are not as cost effective. However, in the longer term, as we forge these better human connections, we do see how we impact outcomes, right? And then in the end, those efficiencies are found.
Yeah, and when you're looking for efficiencies, what efficiencies are you actually looking for? It's kind of, to you, what is a successful interaction, and then how do you learn from that to get there more quickly in the future?
Yeah, so for us, a successful interaction is, definitely a level of patient engagement, and we don't necessarily we don't necessarily measure that in terms of, are we speaking to a patient 12 times for 12 minutes? Because all patient needs are different, right? For some patients, that connection happens with just the initial phone call, the initial handshake. We like to think of it as a hug. Once that patient gets that moment where they feel that hug and that confidence gets instilled, they're on their journey. Our focus is really on the use of, non-healthcare professionals or lay people in a peer-to-patient model. So that alone immediately brings a level of efficiencies, because there are a lot of regular people out there. There are less healthcare professionals, less nurses, less physicians, and all of these different constituents play different roles, essentially in the healthcare system. the physician, the pharmacist, the nurse are the most trusted people in healthcare. And then there's the supporting role with the peers. And the peers just have greater scale, more efficiency, but quite honestly, at the end of the day, are a lot more relatable to the patient, right? They're part of the community, and they have that ability to connect with the patient where the healthcare professional just cannot. And we're able to extend reach to patients beyond that of what the regular healthcare system provides.
So kind of thinking about that peer concept, how do you go about locating peers that can then, be able to provide that ongoing support?
Yes, so our model is quite unique. It is a gig economy model. You think of like Uber. We're sort of the Uber for peer to patient. We basically get folks all around the US that essentially subscribe into our model. They're trained, they're certified, they maintain a level of certification. And amongst themselves, they're part of a community where they share their experiences. And quite honestly, they give each other high fives and share their experiences with how they've had these positive exchanges with patients. So again, just like Uber, we're out there on social media. We're out there recruiting regular people that, quite frankly, want to feel good and give back, and work in a model that's highly flexible. They get to call patients. Some of our folks work 3 hours, some work 30 hours, and very simply, they get to work when they want to, and that comes across in the conversations with patients, because this isn't the call center operation. When you feel like doing good, you go do good, and have conversations with patients. So it's quite unique in that way.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of kind of a social component to it where, or at least my interpretation, what you're explaining is you're kind of tapping into what has always been kind of that positive aspect to the social interactions that technology has enabled, and then hopefully being able to leave the toxic piece out of it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. When we get into these conversations with patients, first of all, it provides a sense of community. We know the healing power of communities, and not everyone could be part of a community. Communities are just not accessible to everyone. But if they get that sense of community for that fraction of a moment, that sliver in their patient journey, it's pivotal. It's pivotal in terms of embarking in a positive direction.
Yeah, and I imagine once you're able to foster that, feeling of positivity, that also has a cascading effect, because if you're able to help the patient, feel better about what's happening and, more in a better frame of mind to, follow through, then that's going to, also have positive impacts on the outcomes for that individual.
Absolutely. And it really is about setting the winning conditions for that healthcare journey. And I mentioned earlier, taking a step back to take two forward. If you ask me the one thing that's kind of most impactful in that, what's the one thing we try to do most? It's unoverwhelm the patient. The healthcare system is information based. The information that comes from prescribing information, from a physician to the pharmacist. We do a very good job at overwhelming a patient, not with the best of intentions. And part of what we do with the peer-to-patient model is really get the patient to feel good about the information, know that they don't need to consume all the information, but let's guide them to what's most relevant to them or most important to them, and let them know that it's digestible, essentially.
Yeah, kind of that digestible piece, I think is definitely impactful, because it's, once you can break something down into smaller pieces, then it feels less insurmountable. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Michael Oleksiw from Pleio. We've been talking a lot about kind of patient journey and care journey and interactions. And Michael, you've talked about, kind of that peer model. How do you get the more traditional system to buy into it, or how do you interact with the more traditional system? Because frequently you can hear concerns of, well, we always did it this way, so we should just keep going in that direction, or just that resistance to change.
Yeah, and that definitely is definitely one of the kind of key attributes that we see in healthcare, right? Is sort of this lemming effect in terms of, even if you're looking at adoption of technology, there's always a kind of a wait and see. So So, it really is, it is something that we're constantly working with, I'm not saying working against, but working with, but when it's viewed as an enabler to access the technology and make things easier, that's essentially how we're winning those battles. And the results. I mean, right now, if you look at the state of pharmacy, in the U.S., pharmacies are, it's a difficult place. It's not easy being a pharmacist today. Pharmacists are overwhelmed with a variety of tasks, and we get to extend that care that they get in the pharmacy in a different way at home. So we get to expand the reach of the pharmacy in many cases into the home with this peer model. And that relieves a burden on the pharmacist. And in particular, if we talk about the concept of working to top of license, that allows the pharmacist to do, to do just that, work to top of license. So I would say that is probably the biggest driver in that we're able to help pharmacy become more efficient by expanding beyond their walls and providing a level of empathy and care beyond what they can get at the counter. So we kind of bring that empathy and care into the home.
Yeah, and kind of focusing on that pharmacy piece, it does seem, that a pharmacist is viewed kind of differently than maybe another professional within healthcare, because it's, you're oftentimes interacting, going into the store and having, a conversation. So that feels, maybe less stressful than being in an office. So your point of, even further extending the reach of that pharmacist, that seems like it could have a very powerful, it could and does have a very powerful impact of, getting back to the beginning of the conversation of changing the patient's perception of this is why this recommendation is being made, or this is why this piece of information is being conveyed at this point in time, to understand how it fits into the broader journey.
Yeah, correct. And I think I mentioned earlier, the pharmacist is largely viewed as one of the most trusted in a patient's medication journey, and being able to again extend that trust beyond the walls of the pharmacy. There's a transactional component that the pharmacist has to deal with, and this allows that non-transactional piece, that emotional piece, to carry over, and that is a critical piece. So all of that trust that's infused in the pharmacy is essentially extended with our calls and the sum of our interventions when the patient's at home.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of that relationship between the pharmacist and the patient, it's and really focusing on the uniqueness that you're talking about. How is that role kind of viewed differently than, say, their doctor or their nurse when when the patient is interacting with the pharmacist?
Yeah, I think it essentially has to do with sort of the purpose, right? For each of these roles, I think, each of the constituents essentially has a very specific role to play. Again, the pharmacist being, highly trusted is sort of the last healthcare professional before the patient actually on that medication journey. So that's sort of the last impression, whereas you kind of have the first impression with the physician, and that's the interaction with the pharmacist is the last impression that the patient is going to deal with and remember, and it's critical because that's going to form a critical behavior based on that impression. So that needs to be extended, it needs to be nurtured, and it needs to we need to pivot on that last kind of trusted pivot that happens at the pharmacy.
Yeah, and I guess building off of that point of being at the last pivot, what direction would you like to see that interaction and that relationship continue to grow into? Understanding, as you said, you're now helping to enable some of that extension by fostering connection in the home and in daily life. But where would you like to see that continue to evolve to?
Yeah, one of my personal initiatives is really to try to make healthcare less transactional. And I would argue that most pharmacists would want to make things less transactional. They probably would like to have less edits and be on a screen less and be at a counter with a patient more. So, I would like to see a lot of what we do come back to the pharmacy. And that would be a great thing. So really, I would say one of my goals would be to try to have healthcare be less transactional, and it's not just at not just at the pharmacy, just broadly across the industry.
Yeah, and knowing that this would probably take a lot of different moving parts working together, but from your perspective, how how do we start getting into that place where it's less transactional? It sounds like more relationship based.
Yeah, and I think that's where my view would be. We'd have to look at healthcare less as an industry and more as a community, and incentivize community. And what I mean by that is we see when we work with, whether we work with pharmaceutical manufacturers, pharmacies, payer groups, employer groups, or anyone that interacts with patients in the community, these patients have these multiple touch points from so many different constituents that are essentially a variety of different point solutions. And that's the product of an industry where, everyone's trying to create these point solutions. But if we were to incentivize community and we could bring those point solutions together, then we have these more harmonic patient journeys, which, as opposed to this sort of juxtaposition of solutions. So, I would love to see partnering and community and collaboration be further incentivized. That's where we find the greater efficiencies. And quite frankly, it also will be a place where patients will get the best of all worlds. And quite frankly, the best solutions will be those that will come together and get used. And we would sort of weed out those that are quite extraneous to the journey.
Yeah, and kind of that certainly sounds like it aligns a lot with what are oftentimes the stated goals of value-based care and models of that nature. Although I would argue that kind of some of what you're describing takes that a step further, because you're not just focusing on enhancing the quality and the outcome, which is going to be a natural piece of it, but really having that baseline fabric of community and collaboration, which I think then feed into the other goals, because then, to your last point, you've got everyone working in coordination as opposed to looking at their individual endpoints or individual silos.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And, in a utopian view, right, we set the destination as, I keep saying like less transactional, more community. And we go away from, return on investment to return on empathy. And of course, there are commercial aspects. Of course, there's a business, there's an economy that revolves around all this. But I think it's just sort of shifting the thinking enough to orient around community, around return on empathy. And that's where we will find those efficiencies. In other words, if we do right by the patient is healthier, we get to the intended outcomes, and the system as a whole essentially does better, becomes more efficient. And it's sort of the gift that keeps giving, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and I think arguments have said that gets to what is often cited as the promise of the shift in approach. At the same time, though, it definitely feels like the system is kind of dragging its feet on getting to that point, because maybe some of those outcomes or that potential realignment, it's not necessarily clear how or when we'll get there. And so much of the industry, to use that word, does pretty well when you look at the financial side of it by existing in the current world.
Yeah, and the system itself is inherently complex. It's multi-tiered, it's multi-layered, and I would say it mirrors patient journeys, which are inherently complex. And if I kind of look at our world, where again we solve for patient journeys by, quite frankly, thinking in an elegantly simple fashion and break things down to small manageable goals. I think it's it's a drip solution to unraveling the complexity. My hope would be that it's done from the patient up, essentially. And again, do right by patient, you do right by the healthcare system as a whole. But yeah, it comes down to solving for those tiny habits, right? For the healthcare community as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that kind of then circles back around to what you were talking about earlier, where to solve for those kind of tiny habit issues, it's thinking about what's the process kind of on an individualized basis, And, how can we go about fostering that right connection, that right community? And, I think on the kind of, well, you've talked a lot about doing that for the patient. There's also kind of that flip side for the pharmacist or the other clinician, where I think they also want to feel connected in and know that they're working in collaboration with their patients and with their colleagues.
Correct. And I think that one of the things, at the onset, kind of spoke about like why we got into healthcare, the infectious nature of helping. That at the end of the day, that's same for the physician, same for the pharmacist, and finding those micro wins, with the patient, that and getting back to the point where it becomes infectious in a good way, to be a pharmacist, for example, and it's not, again, task driven, transaction driven, so on and so forth. I think that is definitely the ultimate goal. And that's again solved for, one patient, one pharmacist, one pharmacy, one healthcare system at a time. And it's great to see, a lot of the innovation, a lot of leadership that's happening out there. And I think that the understanding of the importance of community, we see more and more of it every day.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to frame it. And Michael, believe it, we're already almost out of time. So I want to part with kind of one final question to kind of, maybe build off of that last point. And it's, what's one thing that you would change about healthcare right now to help reemphasize that focus on the one at a time and, kind of being able to call it flip the tile, so each person gets back to that point of fun and passion?
Yeah, we're obviously we you can sort of can't ignore COVID and sort of its impact in terms of this drive toward everything digital. I think it's taking that step back, not sort of chasing the trends. I mean, if you look at, I hoped I was going to ignore using AI at some point in this conversation. I tried really hard. I think I have 3 mentions, but I think it's not to chase the trends, and I think it's getting back to the basics, getting back to what did it mean to be a community pharmacist before? What did that mean in the community? And again, getting back to those basics. And when it comes to technology, pivoting on using technology to better the human relationships, not replace them. And I say that because obviously, there are all these ominous warnings with, the ChatGPT of the world, the generative AI, and all of these different things that, could be really, really helpful, but used in the right way. So my feeling is, let's not jump on the bandwagon. Let's get back to the basics and think about how could technology, how could all of the digital movements, how could they help us do what we've already been doing what we know how to do, doing what we're trained how to do? How can we do that better, but not differently? And that will lead to an evolution, that will lead to doing things differently, but we won't be skipping the steps, right? We'll be sticking to the core of what we do and why we do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great takeaway message because, as I said, believe it or not, we are already out of time. I want to thank my guest, Michael Oleksiw, for a great conversation today.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me again. Can't believe we're up on time. These are always fun.
Yeah, no, and thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.